Hello, this is Jamie with Stonemaier Games, and I love games with low interaction. There are games I love that have high interaction and direct conflict, but I really do love low interaction, and I feel like all the time I hear other reviewers and other gamers talking about multiplayer solitaire games as if it's inherently a bad thing that a game might have a low amount of interaction and engagement with other players. And that's coming from someone who loves genuinely to play with other human beings live at the table. For various reasons that I'll go into this video, I just love low interaction games. And so today I thought I'd dig into my top 7 multiplayer solitaire games, or games that are often called multiplayer solitaire games. I'll debate that a little bit later in the video. And why I think those games work because they are low interaction games. I'll jump right into the list, and then I will talk about some design elements after that. Yeah, and I guess just to define the idea of multiplayer interaction, it's a game where you have very low to little. Well, the literal meaning would be no interaction with other players. The choices that you make do not impact other players at all. That would be, I think, the true definition of multiplayer solitaire. So my number 7 multiplayer solitaire game is going to be Dominion. Dominion is a game that I played a ton when I got into gaming around, 7-8 years ago, kind of into modern gaming. And, it's the quintessential deck building game. It's the first deck building game that I'm aware of. And in Dominion, there is very low interaction with the other players. You are the main source of interaction is the scarcity of cards. So if a certain pile of cards runs out in Dominion, then other players can't get that card. But other than that, there's very low interaction in many of the cards in Dominion. There are some cards, especially in the Intrigue set, where you are directly impacting other players. But that was actually my least favorite set. I didn't really enjoy that set as much. I enjoyed Prosperity a lot, and Seaside, I think, was the other one that I really enjoyed. The expansions to Dominion. And I think one of the reasons that I really love the lack of direct interaction in Dominion is that it allows you to plan ahead on when it's not your turn. You don't have to wait for your turn to come around to make a decision about what you're going to do on that turn. Dominion does a very clever thing where you draw into your hand of cards at the end of your turn, and so then you have a full. Usually, I don't know how many other players are there at the table to plan ahead and decide what you want to do on your turn. You don't have other players interacting with you during that time, that downtime, to interfere with your plans. So I really like that. It really, for me, it helps the flow of the game, especially in a game like Dominion, where turns can end up taking a while if you combo together a bunch of cards that give you multiple actions. So that's Dominion, my number 7, because you can plan ahead on your turn in Dominion. And these characteristics that I'll mention are common to all these games, but I'm just stating ones that are featured in these particular games. I'll put Karuba at number 6. Karuba is a game, I don't have a photo or a copy of it myself, but it's a game where one player, it doesn't matter who, any player, draws a random tile, reveals it to all the players, and then all the other players find that exact same tile of their type. Like if I draw tile number 23, all players will find tile number 23 and put it down on their board in Karuba. And the thing you're trying to do in Karuba is connect paths between your starting point, your adventurers, your explorers, on one side of a grid board, and trying to connect paths using those tiles to various destinations on the other side of the board. It's been a while since I played, but I think that most of the destinations are temples. And in Karuba, it's not true multiplayer solitaire because there is a racing element to it. You're trying to be the first player to reach those temples. And it's really neat in Karuba to see how, even though you were drawing the same tiles and you start out with the exact same board state, the paths that you have on your board end up being very, very different from other players. And that's why in Karuba, in my opinion, it feels really good to be in control of that element, that asymmetry that happens during the game. I think it would not feel nearly as good, in my opinion, if the things that I was doing in Karuba were interrupting your paths. I think that would not mesh well with my style of play. I like that I am in full control in Karuba of where I'm placing that tile and the satisfaction I get from seeing how my paths vary from other players' paths and how I end up maybe feeling clever, maybe feeling a little bit dumb. Either way, I really like that in Karuba. my number 6 multiplayer solitaire game that isn't quite multiplayer solitaire because you are racing to get to certain elements, and that does impact other players. My number 5 is going to be Tiny Towns. Again, that might go higher up on the list. It might go lower. I don't know. I've only played once. It was at Geekway. I haven't played it again since, but I hope I do get to play it again. In Tiny Towns, there are 2 modes of play, and one is less multiplayer solitaire than the other. But I'll talk about one that is more multiplayer solitaire, which is the version that I have not played. But it's where you flip a card to reveal the cube, the type of resource that all players are going to place on their player mat. So it's in the other mode of play, you are selecting on your turn. You are selecting that cube, and so that there is a little bit more interaction there. But there's the less interaction version where the card is randomly determining which resource type all players are going to place. You put it on your board. You are trying to combine different resources on your board, like match 3 video games, mobile games, to build a building. And as you're doing that, it really does not interact with the other players at all. I think there might be some scoring cards that look at majority, like if you have more of a certain building type than other players. That is a way in multiplayer solitaire that you can, when you're comparing yourself to other players, even though you're not directly impacting what they're doing during the game. But in Tiny Towns, I really like that there's this strong sense of ownership over your town. You are creating this thing that is distinctly unique from all the other players, even though, like in Karuba, you and I could end up placing our cubes in the exact same places throughout the game. We could do that, but I think it happens exceedingly rarely in a game like Tiny Towns or Karuba. So that's what I really like about Tiny Towns, my number 5, that sense of ownership over the town that you've built at the end of the game. My number 4, I'm going to give to, it is tough because all 4 of these games I really, really enjoy. I'll give number 4 to Orleans. But really, this could be higher on the list. Actually, no, I'm going to change it. I'm going to give it a number 4 to Welcome 2. It's really, really close here. But in Welcome 2, and Welcome 2 is a game that I have. We've actually exhausted the pad of paper that came with this game because we've played Welcome 2 so much. Welcome 2 is a flip and write game where you're flipping cards in the middle of the table, and all players choose one of those cards combined. There are actually 2 pairs of cards. I'll show you what I'm talking about. There's a card that has a number on it and a card that has a special ability. And then you are writing a number on your suburb here, one of these empty buildings, and choosing to gain the bonus ability if you want. The only interaction in this game comes from the race to get certain bonuses. So there are certain goals. Here's an example of one of the goals that go out on the table at the beginning of the game, and there are 3 of them, and players are essentially racing to be the first to reach that goal. But I think Welcome 2 does something really clever in that the players who don't reach the goal first can still achieve that goal. They just get fewer points for it. So this is the main point of interaction in Welcome 2. And similar to another game I'm going to mention on this list, one of the things I really, really like about this game is how well it scales. I've had game nights where we sit down with 4 people to play Welcome 2, and then someone else unexpectedly shows up, and we throw them in. We have 5. I've had it happen when we've had like 5 people show up, and we add them too. We've definitely played a 10-player game of Welcome 2 because it scales so well because of the lack of interaction between players. It still actually does have that racing element, which still works fine with any number of players. But I love that in the game that doesn't involve direct player interaction, that it can scale so well and continue to scale. I think the box says, what is it, 1 through 99 players? Yeah, 1 through 100 players. It can scale up to 100 players, which obviously you'd rarely do, but I like that it has that flexibility to scale. So that is my number 4, Welcome 2. I'll go back to my number 3, Orleans. This is a bag building game, so kind of similar to Dominion, deck building, bag building, where you are acquiring these workers, and as you acquire a worker, you often move up on a track. So there's this really satisfying feeling of whenever you gain a worker, you are also improving your engine throughout the game. Maybe means you're drawing more workers throughout the game. You get some money right away. You are advancing down a track for end game multiplier points. So I really like that element of Orleans. But one of my favorite things about Orleans is that during the worker placement, it's really action selection, but you're placing workers. Your phase of the game, you're placing them on your own board, it's simultaneous, so it happens at the same time as all other players. You're drawing those tokens out of your bag and placing them on your board, and it's really this cerebral moment where you are thinking, okay, what can I do here? What is the best thing for me? And it happens at the same time as all other players. You don't have to wait for any other players. So I love the speed this allows the game to progress in, because there is simultaneous play happening. The thing that you're doing that impacts no other players happens at the same time. As all other players. There is a little bit of interaction in the game. So there is scarcity in the game. You can run out of resources. You can run out of workers. There's a map in the game there's some soft interaction on that map. If you're the first to grab something on that map, that does matter a little bit. And then there is a board in the game where you can dispose of your workers. We can kind of trash your workers and get rid of them. And there was a little bit of a race in that part of the board to be the first to place workers in certain spaces. But by and large, Orleans is a multiplayer solitaire game. It's very, very low interaction. But I love that about Orleans because it has that simultaneous play. My number 2 actually features the same exact thing. Quacks of Quedlinburg also features simultaneous play. In Quacks, you are bag building, again, another bag building game. During the simultaneous play part of the game, you are drawing out of your bag and hoping not to bust. There's a way that you can bust in Quacks. You can watch a rules video to see how you do this. But while you're doing that, you are kind of paying attention to other players, because one of the things in Quacks is you want to be the player who progresses the furthest on your track. So you are looking around at other players at times, but for most of that phase of the game, you're just drawing simultaneously and making choices based on what you are getting out of your own bag. There's no need to wait for other players during that phase. It would really slow down the game if you did. And I think it really aids the flow of the game that part of the game is a solitaire element. That's just you doing your thing with your potion. Quacks does have a few levels of interaction involving certain tokens that look at what other players do during their round. There is some scarcity involved, although I've never really run into that in my games of Quacks. And there's that element I mentioned of being the furthest to progress on the track in any given round, and there are like 10 rounds, so that's a big deal. You're often looking at what other players are doing, which I think is an oft overlooked thing about these games with low interaction. Someone might look at a game of Quacks and say, although there's multiplayer solitaire, you're not actually targeting any other players. But in reality, you are actually looking around at other players, and you do care what they're doing throughout the game. So that's Quacks, my number 2 multiplayer solitaire game. My number 1 I've saved because I think this is the only truly multiplayer solitaire game on the list, where everything you do during the game, any choice that you make during the game does not impact other players at all. The only interaction is at the end of the game where you compare scores, but I don't consider that player interaction. And that's why the only multiplayer solitaire game on my list is On Tour. This is a roll and write game where you are charting a tour. It's such a heavy box, I don't want to make it sound in the mic, but you're charting. Any player is rolling these dice. Usually we pass them around the table, but it doesn't really matter who rolls them because it's random. You're rolling those dice and then writing down 2 numbers on your map of the U.S. to chart your tour across the U.S. And you're trying to do that in such a way that you can link numbers in ascending order at the end of the game to form the longest tour across the U.S. Like I said, there's no interaction in this game. There's no choice that you make on your turn that impacts any other players. Yet, I have so much fun with this game. It's so easy to teach and play. There's still so many interesting choices, even though you aren't impacting other players. I think that's something that's overlooked about multiplayer solitaire game. There can be tons of interesting choices even though you don't have that interaction. And I love the choices involved here, and I love how well it scales up. On Tour, my box I think has 10 or 12 boards in it. It has quite a few. But any given game of On Tour comes with 4. But you could print out more sheets of paper and continue to scale up. Similar to Welcome To. You could play this remotely with friends. You don't have to even be there with the people you're playing with. And I love the flexibility that provides in On Tour. So I've talked about my top 7 here. As you can see, there's only one game on that list that actually truly is multiplayer solitaire. The rest are just very low interaction games. And I've also now talked about the things in those games, the elements of those games, the low interaction elements that make them so special in my mind, that make me really enjoy them. But I want to talk about a few other things here in terms of game design and how we look at these types of low interaction games. And before I get too far, I do want to mention that in the links below, there are 2 links to a talk and an article from fellow game designer and publisher Gil Hova of Formal Ferret Games. Gil has some really interesting thoughts on multiplayer solitaire games that I highly recommend checking out, and they definitely influenced this video. So I mentioned one thing, and if you do, so one thing that we can think about, I think, in terms of game design is if you do have a game where players are saying, I wish there was more player interaction in this game, but you were like me and you don't want direct conflict, a few elements you can add that I mentioned here are racing elements. So if you're racing to reach something first, racing to achieve something first, like in Orleans, how there's resources on the map, you might be the first to move on the map to get those resources. So first to achieve, or racing elements, and scarcity. I mentioned that several times throughout this video, that there might be a scarcity of resources or cards or something in the game that can lead to interaction. Wingspan is a game of ours that a few people have called multiplayer solitaire. I think there's just more. It's a low interaction game, but there are a number of interactions in Wingspan. One thing you can do in Wingspan, there is a tableau of 3 face-up cards at any given time on the table, and that actually is an element of player interaction in the game. If I'm choosing a card, even though I'm not taking it away from you, I still am choosing a card that you can no longer gain. So that's something I think you can do in a multiplayer solitaire, or in a game with low interaction, to have a tableau of something that is limited on an ongoing basis, that you can, if you choose one of those things, you are taking it away from other players. Wingspan has a few other elements like that. Like Wingspan has cards that you activate that might benefit other players, and so you might choose not to activate them. Wingspan also has abilities that trigger when it's not your turn if another player does a certain thing, so there's some interaction there. And then in Wingspan, there are goals that you look at the end of every round that one side of the goal board has you comparing yourself to the other players in the game in terms of how many birds you maybe have in a certain column or row, or how many eggs you have in a certain place, things like that. So you can have common goals that end up comparing players to one another during the game. That's another way to add a new element of interaction, a reason for players to at least pay attention to one another during the game. Kind of like what Quacks does with that element of pushing farther than other players during the game. I do want to reiterate the point that I think just because you aren't directly attacking other players or interfering with other players doesn't mean it's a multiplayer solitaire game. I think that just means it's a low interaction game. All these elements of soft interaction I've just mentioned, I think, are perfectly viable and can be very fun elements of interacting with other players during a game, without actually disrupting what they're trying to do. Because I think that could end up being really unsatisfying for some gamers. And in the right game, if they're planning ahead for something important, they're working on something or building towards something, and you interfere with that and stop them from doing that, that can be really frustrating. And I guess last, I'll end with a point that Gil kind of emphasizes, that I have seen a lot of reviewers and just people who talk about games talk about multiplayer solitaire as if it is inherently bad. And I just have to disagree with that point, that it is inherently bad. I can appreciate if, in your opinion or your style of play, you don't enjoy games with low player interaction. But I don't think it's inherently bad, and I don't think it's something we should talk about as if it is inherently bad, because I think people enjoy games for different reasons. Gil talks about this in his video, that gamers have different priorities when they play a game. Either universally, you might have a gamer who always enjoys a certain style of play, or just depending on their mood at any given time. There are times where I just want to play a really high interaction game or take that game, but there are also times where I just want to sink into my own world with people around me, but sink into my own world and build my own thing and be proud of that thing that I build. So I hope we don't continue to talk about multiplayer solitaire as if it is inherently bad. And I love it in the comments if you wouldn't talk about it that way. That if you talk about things, you state your opinions as your own. You might like something, but that doesn't mean that you have to take away from the enjoyment of someone else if they do enjoy games with low player interaction. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about all this. I'd love to hear, what type of player are you? Do you like games? Do you generally like games with higher level of player interaction versus low player interaction? Are there games with true multiplayer interaction, games where choices you make during the game truly do not impact other players at all? Are there any that I haven't mentioned on this list? Like I said, On Tour, I believe, is the only game on this list that has absolutely no choices during the game that impacts other players, and yet I still really love it. So I'm curious if you can think of any other games like that, or games with very low player interaction that you really enjoy that you want to mention below. Maybe your top 3, if you can think of top 3 games with very low player interaction that you really enjoy. I'm pretty sure there are some other deck building games that I have forgotten or left out here that have very low interaction, and so feel free to mention them as well. All right, that's it. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments. Thanks.